this video, it's all about the mission. Mission is arguably the most important factor for any nonprofit organization. And related to mission is strategic planning and measuring effectiveness. Before we get into mission, let me explain how this ties into the bigger picture. We're still in part one, which is kind of that foundational basics of nonprofits. In chapter one, you learned the basics of nonprofits, what nonprofits are and what they are not, how they're taxed, what makes them different than for-profit companies, and all that stuff. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the foundation of any nonprofit specifically, which is its mission. Here are your learning outcomes for this chapter. By the end of it, you should be able to understand how important mission is, and adjacent to that, the importance of the mission statement. You should understand the concept of mission drift, what it is, why it can be a bad thing, and how we can prevent it. You should also explain the purpose of organizational vision, values, and principles, how those are distinctive and different from the mission, but also how they tie in underneath that umbrella of mission. You also should be able to articulate the benefits of strategic planning, identifying elements of an effective strategic plan, and understanding how leaders measure effectiveness. And finally, you'll understand a little bit of the criticism around the businessification of nonprofit work. First, let's get into the mission statement and why it is so important for nonprofit agencies. A mission statement simply expresses the purpose of the organization, and it describes how it meets the needs of its stakeholders. Now, most companies out there, for-profit or nonprofit, have a mission statement, but it's especially important for nonprofits because it's key to express the purpose of the cause and describe how that agency fulfills that need in order to garner support from the community. If you were to ask any person off the street to tell you the mission statement of even their most favorite company, their favorite for-profit company where they buy and consume their products and services, they probably would be hard-pressed to tell you what it is. However, if you ask any staunch supporter of a nonprofit, any major donor, they probably can tell you the mission statement of the nonprofit that they support. So why are mission statements and mission so important for nonprofit agencies? Well, as I mentioned, it's central for garnering support because if you can't effectively convey the purpose of your cause and why your nonprofit exists, you'll have a hard time drumming up the support you need to stay in business. It's also important because it serves as a guide for decision making. I've worked in nonprofits my entire career, and every time I was faced with a difficult choice, I always had to ask myself, what is best for the mission? What decision can I make that best aligns with the mission of this organization? It also serves as a guideline for goal setting, and it helps determine the best way to allocate those precious and limited financial resources. Given the importance of a mission statement for a nonprofit agency, it's shocking how many of them don't always do a great job with this. A good mission statement for a nonprofit should have 4 traits. It should be simple, clear, accurate, and inspirational. Let me explain a little bit more about these things. A mission statement should be simple. It shouldn't be overly complex. It shouldn't contain a bunch of jargon that the average person doesn't understand what it means. If you can't convey your mission in a way that's understandable to most people, it's not going to be effective. You also need to make it clear who the organization serves and highlight its values. This is central for getting that important support. You have to explain why your nonprofit exists. You have to explain who you serve and what you do. It also needs to be accurate. Don't embellish, don't engage in hyperbole, don't exaggerate, but give an accurate representation in that mission statement of what it is exactly that your nonprofit does. While you need to be realistic, you also do need to balance that with being inspirational. A mission statement should make people feel something. It should make them feel hopeful. It should inspire some type of emotion or compelling reason why people should give to your cause. So now that you know why mission is important, especially for nonprofits, now that you know those 4 key factors to an effective mission statement, let's talk about how we can avoid mission drift. But first, let me explain what mission drift is. Mission drift occurs when an organization loses focus on its original mission and it gets off track, and it starts to pursue unrelated activities. Think of your organizational mission as a train on a track. If you're leading the organization, it's your job to keep that train on the track toward achievement of that mission. You can't get sidetracked. You can't get distracted. Otherwise, you start to veer that train off the tracks. And if you go too far astray, you can actually derail it completely, leading to catastrophe. It's the same thing with a mission. You have to stay laser focused on your mission and not pursue unrelated activities. And it's hard. As we discussed in the last chapter, you've got a lot of different stakeholder groups with a lot of different and sometimes conflicting needs. And whenever you're trying to make a decision about how to fulfill these needs, often when they're in contrast to one another, you have to always keep in mind, What course of action stays true to the mission? Otherwise, you start to drift astray from your mission, and that's when mission drift occurs. Now, mission drift is usually a slow and gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. And that is what makes it insidious and it makes it dangerous because it can happen to even the best nonprofit leaders. Oftentimes, it happens so gradually that it goes completely unnoticed until it really starts to negatively impact the cause. So, why does mission drift happen? Well, it can happen for a variety of factors. It can be a change of leadership. You have new leaders who come in either at the board level or at the staff level, and they maybe don't fully understand the mission, or maybe the mission statement isn't well written and they don't fully understand the real root and purpose of that mission. It can also come from external pressures. If you're leading a nonprofit and someone comes to you with an opportunity, maybe it doesn't exactly fit with your mission, but you feel pressured because maybe that person is a major donor and you're afraid that if you don't pursue that opportunity, they'll be disappointed or they'll discontinue support. It can also happen because sometimes there's just a lack of clarity in the organization's mission. So if you're leading a nonprofit, it takes an active and concerted and ongoing effort to prevent mission drift from happening. So it's important to enact strategies to make sure this doesn't happen. And this includes regular mission reviews, ensuring that all the activities that you're engaging in align with that mission and that you also engage in good organizational design. So let's talk a little bit more about a mission review because sometimes the mission maybe should and could change. If there is a legitimate change in the organization's purpose, it's the responsibility of nonprofit leaders to do this mission review, to examine it, to look at the original mission statement, to really do a needs analysis, to be able to do an organizational assessment and determine, is this mission really true to why we're here? Is this true to the purpose of our work? And if not, maybe we should look at tweaking it or changing it completely. But doing a mission review shouldn't be done by just any one person. In nonprofit organizations, collaboration is key. We learned that in the last chapter when we studied the traits of highly effective nonprofit organizations. Conducting a mission review should involve engaging a number of stakeholders, including staff, board members, volunteers, and donors, and examining that mission statement to really do some workshopping and determine whether or not that mission aligns with the organization's values, goals, and objectives. And if that's no longer the case, the organization has to make one of two choices. They either have to start making decisions that are more in alignment with that original mission, or they can look at revising their mission. So now that you know the importance of mission and how this is that overarching umbrella that guides the organization, let's talk about some of those elements that go underneath that umbrella, but still help lead strategic decision-making. And these are vision, values, and principles. A vision statement outlines the long-term aspirations and goals of an organization. It describes the desired future state of the organization. So we know where we're at now, but here's where we want to be in the future. Here's what we're working toward. And it also needs to provide a clear picture of what the organization hopes to achieve in the long run. So think of the vision as being visionary. It's big picture. It's aspirational. It's about long-term goals. But all of those need to be in support and in alignment with the overarching mission. Next is the vision. Organizational mission is who the organization is today. The vision is where you want to be in the future. So think of it this way. The organizational mission, that overarching mission, that represents who the organization is today, who you are, why you exist, who you serve. Whereas the vision is where you want to be in the future. So mission and vision, they're complementary. They should not be in contradiction with one another, and they do need to be interconnected. That vision statement, again, that is meant to be aspirational, where we want to be, where we can be if we just have the support from people. Because it needs to inspire and motivate your stakeholders, your donors, your volunteers, your supporters, your corporate sponsors, and inspire them to work towards a common goal. In addition to a mission and or vision, some nonprofit agencies choose to go a step further and actually define those convictions that direct their actions and decision making. And these are what we call organizational values. Now, it's important to note that aside from mission, which is critical, essential, required, no questions asked, vision and values and some of these other things, they are optional. You'll find some agencies that have them. Some might have mission and vision, but no values. Some might have only a mission, and that's okay. But organizations that choose to establish values do them because these are serving as the foundation of their organization's culture. They're meant to establish that framework for how they engage and interact with various stakeholders. Now, values can be great. They can be a really useful tool for strategic planning and working toward mission achievement. But sometimes nonprofits get a little crazy with this and they have a whole bunch of values. And if you have 10, 20 values, then really what do you stand for? So, best practices say that nonprofits should define a set of absolutely no more than 3 to 7 values. Really refine and determine those key values that are most important to your agency and its cause. Now, if you want to even go one step further, you can even choose to articulate principles. Principle is a behavior and a mindset, and this is a standard in the workplace that's reflective of action orientation. And it's action in response to one of those core values. So this can get a little confusing. So think of it this way. Think of values as that fundamental belief or characteristic of the organization itself. And a guiding principle, on the other hand, is something that is a practical expression of that value. So if one of your values is diversity, a principle might be the actions that you engage on to work toward that, like equitable hiring practices, like doing compensation assessments, things like that. Now, again, it's important to note not all organizations specify principles. They all should have a mission. Many of them also have a vision. Some of them have values, but even fewer of them choose to specify principles. So here's how these things all kind of tie in together. The mission, again, that's who you are today, who you are and what you do. The vision is aspirational. That's forward future thinking. It's who you want to be. The values are what you stand for, what's important to you. But again, no more than 3 to 7, otherwise it defeats the purpose. And then principles are a reflection of how we act to express our values. So if you work for a nonprofit or if you're doing an agency analysis, this is a great first step to make sure that you've got that foundation in place. Because if the foundation is rocky, you're destined for failure. Make sure that you have a mission that really is well written, that is reflective without embellishment. There is a forward looking aspirational vision of who that agency wants to be, that the agency has values reflective of what they stand for, but ensuring there are no more than 3 to 7, and principles more of an optional thing. But even if it's not specifically articulated, seeing that the organization is actually carrying out behaviors that are reflective of those values. Basically, they're not just talking the talk, which are values, but they're walking the walk too. Now, I wanted to give you an example of a real life nonprofit representation of mission, vision, values, and principles. I chose Habitat for Humanity because they are one of those agencies that chooses to use 3 of the 4. They have an overarching mission, which in their case is seeking to put God's love into action. They bring people together to build homes, communities, and hope. So this says who they are today, what they do, and who they serve. The vision, however, is aspirational. This is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. So in their perfect world at Habitat for Humanity, if they're successful in doing what they're doing, that they will ultimately achieve a world where everyone has a decent place to live. And then they have principles that fall in alignment with that vision and with that overarching mission. So again, think of mission is that top umbrella view, and vision and principles and values support those things. And while Habitat doesn't specify values, they do have principles. And remember, principles are those action-oriented responses to values. So even though they don't have values articulated here, you can pretty much determine what they are based upon these principles. And as you can see, their principles are action oriented. Things like focusing on shelter, advocacy, demonstrating, promoting, supporting. These are all action words. So now that you understand the importance of mission and a mission statement to articulate that mission, along with principles and values and vision, let's talk about how nonprofit leaders can use strategic planning to make sure that they're working toward those goals. Strategic planning, this is something that's used in the for-profit sector as well, but it's really important in nonprofits. It's a broad term that basically just refers to different approaches used to steer decision making in an organization. And usually this is kind of on that long-term perspective. The outcome of strategic planning is an actual strategic plan. This is a very high-level document. It's very thorough. It's very comprehensive. Usually it's a pretty lengthy document. And it's meant to outline the organization's long-term goals, along with the methods that it plans to use to achieve those goals. As I mentioned, strategic planning, this is long range. This is not those day-to-day tactical plans, but they're strategic, they're long-term. Generally, a strategic plan will span a time period of about 3 to 5 years. So you'll find a lot of nonprofits will come together, they'll do a strategic planning session, come up with a strategic plan, work toward that strategic plan, doing the things that they said they're going to do in the plan. And they'll usually do it for a period of 3 to 5 years. And then every 3 to 5 years, they'll revisit, they'll redo the process, they'll tweak the plan. Sometimes they'll scrap the plan, start all over for another 3 to 5 year period. Now, there are definite benefits to strategic planning. This is why most successful organizations do them. Nonprofits in particular can benefit from strategic plans because it helps them with resource allocation. We have very limited resources in nonprofits, and that's not just money, but that's time, that's people, it's everything. And we're always being called to make decisions that require us to figure out how to allocate those resources. How do we prioritize needs? How do we balance those differing stakeholder needs that, again, as we talked about in the last lesson, are often at odds with each other and conflicting? A strategic plan helps guide us because we're human beings. We all make decisions differently. We all fall prey to decision making fallacies and problems. And so strategic plans just help make sure that we're keeping that train on track. Just like with the mission, strategic planning is about keeping things on track. Now, here is a sad and sobering statistic. Nearly half, yes, half of all nonprofits do not have a strategic plan. And that, in my opinion, is a huge miss. So if you work for a nonprofit agency or you're doing an agency analysis, it's critical to ask, do we have a strategic plan? If not, why the heck do we not have a strategic plan? And more important, what do we need to do to get a strategic plan as soon as possible? Because without a strategic plan, you're more prone to mission drift, you're more prone to decision-making problems, you're more prone to not allocating resources properly, and a whole host of other problems. While a strategic plan is important, it's important too that it's not just any old strategic plan, but it's a good strategic plan. It's effective. So let's talk about the things that we need to do to ensure that we're developing good, effective, solid strategic plans. Because strategic plans are meant to keep that train on the track, same thing as mission, it needs to be complementary to the mission. And often strategic plans begin with the mission. If you're sitting down and you're doing a strategic planning session, you have to ask yourself, what is our mission? Again, that's why we're here. It's why we come to work. It's why we volunteer. It's why we donate. Why are we here? You start with the mission and then you articulate the vision if you have one. And if you don't have one, maybe you should establish one because again, the mission is who you are and where you are today. The vision is where you want to be in the future. From there, in a strategic plan, you'll start to drill down. You've got your mission, you got your vision. Now you need goals. Now you need to establish specific, measurable, and achievable objectives that you aim to accomplish over the 3 to 5 year time period, usually, that will help you achieve that mission and ultimately that vision. If you search for strategic plans or strategic plan templates, you'll find hundreds of different options. So there's no one gold standard for what a strategic plan should look like or what terminology you should use when you define things like strategic objectives, goals, things like that. But you will find common elements across most strategic plans. The plan needs to first detail your overarching strategies. That's why it's a strategic plan. So, what are the strategies that your organization is going to employ to reach its goals? But you also need action plans because, again, you have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. What are the things that you're actually going to do? Those tactical steps, those initiatives, those action oriented things that you're going to put into practice that support those strategies. Many strategic plans also include performance metrics because it's one thing to put down on a piece of paper and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's our strategy. Here are the tactical steps that we're going to do to enact that strategy and achieve that strategy versus actually doing it. And a lot of times nonprofits will put together a strategic plan. It might even be an amazing strategic plan, but they put it on a shelf, it gathers dust, and therefore is completely ineffective and virtually useless. So you have to have performance metrics to make sure that you're regularly relying on that strategic plan. You're measuring performance versus what you said you were going to do, identifying any gaps, and as a leader, resolving those gaps to make sure that you're staying on track. So as a nonprofit leader, this should be your guidebook. This should be your playbook. This should be the map that tells you how and where and when to drive that train. You don't want to leave this up to a person-to-person basis because, again, every person is different. This is what keeps everyone cohesive and everyone aligned. In a nonprofit organization, remember, you've got several different key stakeholder groups. You've got several different types of leaders. You've got people operating as teams and sometimes with conflicting needs and values and wants. So the strategic plan is making sure everyone gets on the same page with it. It also ensures that you're not slacking when it comes to tracking performance and making adjustments to strategy when needed. Because if that train starts to go off the track, sometimes you can fix it if you realize it's going off track. But if you're completely oblivious to the fact that you're going off track because you're not measuring your performance regularly, then you have a derailment in store in your future. And that's bad news. Strategic plans, they are not this golden goose, this holy grail, this set in stone, completely inflexible thing. In 3 to 5 years, a lot of things can change. You might even actually see mission drift happen. You might do a mission review. You might determine, you know what? We do need to revisit our mission and revise it. And when you do that, you probably need to completely overhaul your strategic plan as well. So while the strategic plan needs to be a guiding document, it also needs to be flexible. Now, not any one person should be in there changing major strategic goals. It needs to be a collaborative effort with those key stakeholder decision makers. But strategic plans can adapt, and arguably they should. So, if you want to see a visual representation of a nonprofit strategic plan framework, it might look something like this. First, you have the name of the organization and the organizational mission and vision, because remember, this is that foundation. This is what is going to drive everything. And the mission is who you are today, whereas vision is who you want to be in the future. It's aspirational. Then from there, you should establish your primary goals. You can have more than 3, but more than 7 starts to become a little unwieldy. But for purposes of this graphic, I chose 3. You have 3 goals. Here are 3 goals that we want to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years, or however long your strategic plan is designated for. Then beneath each of those goals, you have strategies and action plans and performance metrics. So what are your strategies that you're going to pursue to achieve each of these goals? And what are the actions you're going to take in pursuit of those strategies? And how are you going to measure that performance to make sure you're doing what you said you were going to do? And if you're falling short, that as a leader, you're taking steps to correct that. I'm going to be honest, strategic planning, it is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. It is a very labor and time intensive endeavor, which is why probably half of nonprofits do not have a strategic plan. They don't see it as a priority. They think it takes too long. It does take a long time. It involves a lot of people doing strategic planning sessions, because it's meant to be a collaborative process involving various stakeholders. So a lot of nonprofits opt to just say, well, we don't need one. And usually you'll find they're not very successful. I would argue that most successful nonprofits, if not all of them, including those top 10 most influential nonprofits that we learned about in lesson 1, all have not just a strategic plan, but a strategic plan that they regularly revisit, and they have really strong performance metrics to make sure that they're working toward and achieving the goals that they set. Now, doing a strategic planning effort, it is labor intensive. Some nonprofits will actually spend weeks, if not months, coming up with that initial strategic plan. Or if it needs a big overhaul after 5 years, it's a big process. But a valuable tool in doing a strategic plan is a SWOT analysis. And this is really helpful because it helps you determine your nonprofit's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So then you can guide a strategic direction that maximizes those strengths and opportunities, helps make up for those shortfalls and those weaknesses, and thinks ahead of how you're going to react if those threats do arise. So it is important to start with the right people. You have the right stakeholders, you have the right decision makers who need to come together and collaborate. It can't be just staff, it can't be just volunteers, it can't be just donors. It needs to be a mix of people. And when these stakeholders work together, to come together, to look at a SWOT analysis, to brainstorm, to make sure their mission is where it needs to be, and then to develop strategies that align with that mission under those 4 dimensions, the organization can build an effective strategic plan. And that's going to increase their likelihood of success. Once you have a strategic plan, that's awesome. That's a great first step. You've got the right people together. You've done your strategic planning session, including a SWOT analysis. You've come up with all of those strategies, those action plans. You've revisited your vision and your mission and made sure that that's on point. But now, again, you don't want to just put it on a shelf and let it gather dust. That's dumb. That's a waste of time. That's checking a box just to say, well, we did strategic planning, pat ourselves on the back and move on and not get the benefit of it. So it's really important that nonprofits need to measure the effectiveness. And one way they do this is through KPIs, or key performance indicators. One way nonprofits evaluate performance, and for-profit companies do this too, and they do this either through strategic planning and or outside of it, is the use of KPIs, or key performance indicators. So KPIs are just measurable values. They're taking things and they're quantifying them. They're putting a number on it. So we can say, here's what we're going to do as a goal. Here's what we're doing as actual performance, and measuring if there is alignment there or if there is a miss, then you take action to fix and correct that gap. This is critical for current and future success, because if you're not tracking your performance, you really have no idea how you're doing and you're not making progress toward that organizational mission. Now, a lot of nonprofits will have KPIs for paid staff, and that's important. But what a lot of nonprofits fail to do, that I think is also equally as important, is to have KPIs for other key stakeholder groups as well, and holding them accountable, because that's ultimately what KPIs are, is holding people accountable in terms of performance. Many successful nonprofits will actually establish KPIs for their board of directors and their key leaders and their key volunteers as well, not just paid staff. So I want to take a moment to talk about some of the most commonly used KPIs in nonprofit organizations. And remember, KPIs can be used to measure overall organizational achievement and performance or individual or team performance as well. When it comes to the organization as a whole, many nonprofits measure what's called efficiency margin. This is a calculation of the percentage of expenses that go toward their programs and services compared to their administrative and fundraising expenses. A higher efficiency margin is going to reflect that a larger proportion of the organization's budget goes directly toward fulfilling its mission. Now, if you ever work in a nonprofit, currently, in the past, or in the future, you'll find that for a lot of donors and a lot of nonprofits, they care deeply about efficiency margin. So the way this is expressed, for example, is if I say, I'm executive director of such and such nonprofit, we have an efficiency margin of 83.5%. That means 83.5 cents of every dollar donated to that organization goes toward fulfilling its mission in terms of programs and services. So donors care about that. They want to know, if I'm donating my hard-earned money to you, is it actually going to fulfill the mission, or is it being wasted on frivolous things? Donors are very conscientious about what they perceive to be waste or overhead cost or paying staff too much or spending too much on marketing or things like that. So efficiency margin is a commonly used KPI for a lot of nonprofits that have a strong efficiency margin. It's their holy grail, and they brag about it and scream from the mountaintops about it. But there can be an argument made that too much hyper focus on efficiency margin can actually be dangerous, because that limits nonprofits' willingness to invest in smart things that might require money for growth and scale. So there's kind of two sides to this thing, but overall, usually, generally speaking, efficiency margin, bigger is better, because that means that the nonprofit is spending more money on the mission rather than other things. So to give you another example of a reflection of efficiency margin, it's usually represented as a percentage. So if a nonprofit has efficiency margin of 91%, again, that means 91 cents of every dollar that's donated to the organization goes towards its mission. And going towards mission means it's spent specifically on programs and services. Now, if you were to ask someone, well, what's a good efficiency margin? Generally, bigger is going to be perceived as better, because it means more donor dollars are going to mission. But if you use a benchmark of efficiency margins against peer agencies, generally as a collective in the United States, most nonprofits use a general threshold of around 75%. So if you're working for a nonprofit or you're doing an agency analysis, you might want to look at what that efficiency margin is. And if it is below 75%, really do a deep dive into why that margin is so low. One, is it being calculated properly? And if it is, and it is really below 75%, is that nonprofit making smart and proper spending decisions, or are they frivolously wasting money? Now, as I noted before, there can sometimes be an argument for having a lower efficiency margin. If you need to bring on new staff because you're expanding, or you're building an affiliate network and you need to lease out office space for the first time, that's essential for growth, which is essential for ultimately achieving your mission, but that takes money, and that's going to give a ding to your efficiency margin. Another common set of KPIs used by nonprofits, of course, are fundraising KPIs. These are metrics used to evaluate fundraising performance. Some of these KPIs include things like donor retention rate, and this is measuring the percentage of donors who continue to support the organization over time. Because just like for-profit companies need to retain their customers, because it's cheaper to keep a customer than to go out and acquire a new one, the same principle applies in the nonprofit sector. It's cheaper to keep and retain an existing donor than to go out and try to find a new one. So donor retention is an important KPI for a lot of nonprofits. Another is fundraising efficiency. Sometimes this is referred to as cost per dollar raised. What you might expect from that definition is that this reflects what it costs the organization to raise $1 in donations. So if you have a 90-cent cost per dollar raised, or 90% cost per dollar raised, that means that is costing your organization 90 cents for every $1. So you're only keeping 10 cents in profit. Not a great fundraising efficiency, or not a great cost per dollar raise. So nonprofits will use this often to evaluate their fundraising KPI efforts overall, or they'll sometimes use it to individually evaluate specific campaigns. For example, if you raise money through a telethon where people call on the phone to solicit donations, that usually has a not so great cost per dollar raised. It's very expensive relative to the money that you get back. Versus an email campaign, that might actually yield less in dollars, but it's pretty efficient, it's pretty cheap, and you're going to have a much more favorable cost per dollar raised or a greater fundraising efficiency margin. Fundraising return on investment, or ROI, is meant to assess the effectiveness of fundraising campaigns. So again, sometimes you want to evaluate a campaign to look at the amount of money overall that you've spent, in addition to things like the cost per dollar raised. But overall, how much did you spend? How much did you bring in? What was your net result? How much time did it take? Things like that. And some other non-fundraising based KPIs used in nonprofits include salary productivity ratio and volunteer retention. Salary productivity ratio measures the efficiency of your staff compensation by looking at the total payroll expenses compared to the organization's overall expenses. Now, I think there are a few people out there that would say folks in the nonprofit sector are paid too much, but sometimes this can be askew. And sometimes you find that you have too many people on staff relative to what you're bringing in on fundraising. So your salary productivity ratio is pretty terrible, in which case you either need to up your fundraising or reduce headcount. Volunteer retention measures the percentage of volunteers who continue to volunteer over time. Just like our donor retention measures donors who come back and support year after year, volunteer retention is the same thing, but this reflects people who give of their time versus their money. Volunteer engagement assesses the impact of volunteer work. Some KPIs are difficult because not everything is easily quantifiable. You can't always put everything into numbers. So, for example, when you measure impact, well, what is that? Is that a dollar amount that goes back into the community? But what if you're changing lives? How do you quantify that? You can't always do that. So, volunteer engagement can be a trickier KPI because impact of volunteer work can sometimes be hard to measure. While it can be hard to quantify in numbers overall impact, many nonprofits also use program impact metrics to at least try to put some number onto things to gauge performance. And this can be things like quantifying how many beneficiaries were served. So if your mission is to feed the hungry, how many people did you feed in the last fiscal year? Or things like program goal achievement or beneficiary outcomes. Now, measuring performance, it takes time, and a lot of nonprofit leaders are short on time. Nobody has time to be sitting down and manually calculating all of these things. Nobody has time for it. Nobody's going to do it. So a lot of nonprofits make use of modern technology and tools like BI dashboards. BI stands for business intelligence, and that's just a software program that takes all the numbers from the organization and crunches it and presents it in a visually appealing and easily understandable way. So when I worked in the nonprofit sector, the first thing I would do every morning as executive director would be log into my computer, even before I check my email, pull up my BI dashboard to look at those key goals and those KPIs and make sure that performance was on track. Usually it's graphically represented. Usually green is good, red is red alert, to kind of look out for and flag any deficiencies that I had. So I knew, okay, this needs some attention because it's falling short. And if I don't take action and step up efforts, we're going to miss this goal or this KPI for the year. So BI dashboards are a really valuable tool for nonprofit agencies. And finally, I want to end this lesson with an important discussion, which is that there is some criticism around the commercialization of nonprofit work. Now, I developed this class and wrote the accompanying textbook to actually put a business perspective on nonprofit work. Because in many universities, nonprofit degrees are held in the colleges of social work or in arts and sciences. And unfortunately, students get degrees in those disciplines, but they kind of miss out on the business education. And I would argue that nonprofits, they are a business. It's everything we talked about in lesson 1. And it's kind of hard to fulfill any mission if you can't operate as a functional business. Just realistically speaking, you have bills to pay. You have to keep the lights on. And if you can't bring in money and have a net profit to go toward mission, you're not going to be successful as a nonprofit, and therefore you'll never achieve your mission. But there is some criticism of that. We shouldn't be so focused on business aspects. We shouldn't be so laser focused on KPIs and strategic planning, but rather it should be about serving the world and making the world a better place. So this is this concept of doing well versus doing good. So doing well versus doing good, these are two different measures of success that are often used to evaluate effectiveness of a nonprofit. Because you can be a nonprofit and you can have the most amazing KPIs. You can have billions of dollars of fundraising, razor thin margins on all the right things, really great cost per dollar raised. But if you're not actually making an impact on the community, then are you really that effective? So doing well versus doing good is basically saying these are different measures of success. You might be doing well financially and from a business perspective, but are you actually doing any good for the world, for the community, for making it a better place? But then there's also criticism of, well, focusing too much on doing good at the detriment of doing well means you're going to go out of business. So this is a critique sometimes in nonprofit work that it has become too commercialized, that there's an overemphasis on business factors. It's been too businessified. There's too much of an emphasis on financial factors over the human element and why nonprofits exist in the first place, which in most cases, but not all, is to make the world a better place. So in summary, doing well, that refers to a nonprofit's ability to operate successfully as a business. And this is often measured through strategic plans, KPIs, financial performance, amount of donations that are brought in, salary productivity ratio, those sorts of things. Whereas doing good refers to an organization's ability to create that positive social impact, to contribute to a greater good. That's why it's called doing good. Now, I think most people would reasonably say nonprofits should be doing both of these things. You have to do well in order to stay in business to do good. But if you're just doing well and you're doing no good, there's no purpose to exist. So it's all about finding that balance. Now, doing good is pretty hard to measure, right? So how can you say, okay, we're changing the world? You can say, well, we've fed, 10 million people or we've built 5,000 houses. But it's really hard to measure something like doing good because it's often qualitative, not quantitative in nature. So even if you look at the Forbes list of America's top 100 charities, they do an assessment that considers things like private donations, total revenue, fundraising efficiency. And what you see in figure 2.5 here are America's top 5 nonprofits based on those financial metrics. But what is notable in this is the omission of any calculation or assessment of the doing good part. How are these causes actually helping people? How are they doing good? How are they using this money? They're great at bringing in money. They're great at spending money smartly and managing money. But what are they doing with that to do good? But given that doing good is so difficult to measure, sometimes you have to measure doing well and measure those financial aspects. And I'll tell you a little personal anecdote too that's kind of interesting in this argument. When I wrote my textbook and sent it off to reviewers, they are anonymous, so I don't know who they are, but they're faculty at other universities all across the world. And the number one criticism that I got in my feedback was that this is too focused on business. And my response to that was, well, there are many books and there are many courses and there are whole degree programs at universities that do focus on the doing good part at the exclusion of the doing well part. And so the whole purpose for me writing this book, the whole purpose for me designing this class is to bridge that gap between social work and doing good and serving the world and communities, but also the practical business side and doing those things together in tandem. Because again, you can't do good if you can't keep the lights on. And I would argue that nonprofits that are successful and functioning more like for-profit organizations from a business standpoint have a better chance of achieving impact in terms of doing good because they're more likely to be successful. So there you have it. Everything you need to know, at least the basics, in terms of organizational mission, as well as how we build strategic plans around achieving that mission and how we measure our effectiveness toward achieving that mission.